The US military is one of the largest climate polluters. Environmental pollution is at an all-time high for 2022. We often hear conversations about who is the largest climate polluter. Is it industrial agriculture, energy transportation, fashion, or food retail? The reality is that within our national security, which is the military, there is a large amount of damage they have created throughout the world. It's not to say other industries are less important, as what we are facing is an interconnected crisis, but before we delve into our video, make sure to hit the subscribe button to continue supporting the work I do. So, what is the military-industrial complex? The military-industrial complex is a nation's military establishment, as well as the industries involved in the production of armament and other military materials. In his 1961 farewell address, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower famously warned the public of the nation's increasingly powerful military-industrial complex and the threat it posed to American democracy. Eisenhower urged Americans to be very wary of the potential for the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower's two terms as US presidents throughout 1953 and 1961 coincided with an era of military expansion unlike any other in nation's history. Rather than draw down troops as it had in World War II, the US military kept a large standing army after the Korean War ended in 1953 and maintained a high level of military preparedness due to the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. These predictions turned out to be true, and the US arms industry continued to grow and become influential in the arms race in the coming decades. In the 1960s and 1970s, the content of the military-industrial complex dominated much of the critical discussions of US foreign and domestic policies. The basic idea behind this concept is that there are close relationships between the corporate elite, bureaucrats, and politicians, and these actors work together to ensure that state military investments serve the interests of capital over public safety. The self-serving interests were more centered on protecting the rich people, but the reality of that is when we dig deeper is realizing how war has essentially created many racial and economic disparities that we see today. So, how does this differ from the prison-industrial complex? In contrast, the justification for the prison-industrial complex was based on an internal threat, which was the fear of crime that is still rooted in white supremacy behavior. However, there are similar parallels in how we see the prison and military-industrial complexes as vested institutions that harness power and wealth still uphold global capitalism. The military is concerned on the basis of external threats of foreign powers. If you haven't watched the last video on the prison-industrial complex and environmental justice, I highly recommend you to check that video out too. According to Eisenhower, the conjunction of an immense military establishment and large arms industry is the new American experience. And he feared it would not lead to policies that would not benefit Americans as a whole, like the escalation of the nuclear arms race at great cost to the nation's well-being. Today, the United States routinely outspends every other country for military and defense expenditures. So, what is the environmental impact of the US military-industrial complex? This is a really great question that many people seek to examine throughout history. Back in 2019, the US military released a report analyzing the Department of Defense climate risk. The Pentagon thoughtfully acknowledged that rising temperatures are, quote-unquote, reshaping the world with more frequent, intense, and unpredictable extreme weather conditions caused by climate change. But they failed to analyze the Defense Department's own contributions to climate change. Yet again, we've seen the failure from within the internal operating system to be able to give public information on the whole environmental footprint on the military-industrial complex. But a study that in 2019 from Durham and Lancaster University found that the US military was one of the largest climate polluters in history by consuming more liquid fuels and emitting more CO2 than most countries. In fact, if the US military was its own nation state, it would be the 47th emitter of the greenhouse gases in the world. This report was released by Durham and Lancaster University as an independent public assessment and calculated US military pollution through critical analysis of its logistical supply chains around the world. and this study establishes the US military-industrial complex as one of the largest consumers of hydrocarbons. However, it is important to note that this was only taking into account the emissions from the fuel usage. When we're looking into their dumping practices, ecological destruction towards communities is often not reported. So why is it so difficult to gather information from the US military regarding to their emissions? The US military is a vast infrastructure and relies upon an extensive global network of trucks, cargo planes, and container ships that supply its operations. These operations can range from anything to humanitarian aid to bombs and hydrocarbon fuels. And gathering data about the US Armed Forces can be extremely difficult. With their decision to withdraw from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the US is exempt from reporting its own military emissions. However, gathering statistics from their negligent actions can be obtained through local news organizations, NGOs, lobbyists, and freedom of information requests. Military land pollution is often not accounted for, and there is little to no accountability when we use an environmental justice lens. The fact is that the military is able to opt out of several environmental laws since it's seen as national security. And we've seen this across many rural towns where their own water supply is contaminated from decades of military testing. How does environmental justice intersect with the military-industrial complex? When referencing our environmental justice principle number 15, which opposes military occupation, repression, and exploitation of lands, people, culture, and other life forms, we can begin to draw connections on certain events of history. Two of the most harrowing cases in the US military pollution activity were the nuclear weapon tests they performed in the Marshall Islands and the Navajo Indian Reservation. From 1946 to 1958, the United States tested 67 nuclear weapons in what is now known as the Republic of the Marshall Islands. These weapon tests have been equated to being 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb, and the fallout from the test had the largest impact on four northern atolls, which were Eniwetok, Bikini, Rongelap, and Utrecht, each of which were evacuated due to the radiation emitted from these tests. Radiation poisoning, birth defects, leukemia, thyroid, and other cancers are just a few of the detrimental, life-threatening consequences experienced by the residents of those islands more than 75 years later. This intersects with reproductive, economic, and health justice, where people who are indigenous are the most affected by these injustices. US military land pollution does not take the form of nuclear testing, but it can also take other forms of military real estate. Reports have indicated both domestic and foreign US military bases to rank among some of the most polluted in the world. This is due to the astonishing amount of toxic chemicals such as perchlorate and other components to jet fuel that are found to contaminate drinking water, aquifers, and the soil surrounding the bases. We currently see this happening in Hawaii, where a percentage of residents have lost access to clean water due to US military storing harmful fuels near their aquifers. Abandoned military sites are very common, with reports finding that almost 900 of the 1,200 Superfund sites in the US alone are abandoned by military sites. These military sites are also said to be contaminated with special cleanup grants distributed to them from the government. Wars create injustice and power imbalances. They do not maintain law and order, but rather who can uphold the largest global economic and political power. Aside from their destructive contribution to climate change, US military wars have had devastating effects on the economies and populations of the countries they intervene in. Perhaps one of the most recent cases of their detrimental environmental record is the intervention of Iraq. The Iraqi economy is now suffering tremendously as they are now forced to import nearly 80% of their food due to the desertification of 90% of Iraqi territory. Furthermore, US policies are negligent and disregard the safety of their troops as well as the Iraqi population. A refugee crisis following a war is inevitable, and this is another dangerous result from American interventions. Surges of migrants from Middle East, North Africa, and Central America have been attempting to flee to Europe and the US, and unfortunately the response from both Europe and the US has been to tighten their borders and to increase military activity. Furthermore, refugees and internally displaced people are on the front lines of the climate emergency and are the most vulnerable people who are likely to be disproportionately affected, as reported by the UN Refugee Agency. The military-industrial complex will further create a pipeline to those fleeing into America or Europe to the prison and immigration industrial complex, which we've seen with undocumented farm workers. In my experience, witnessing the rise of US imperialism and the continued increase in budgeting for the military honestly scares me, and it should be talked about more in the modern environmental movement. It's not to say that activists, scientists, or advocates haven't been talking about these things, as we want to ensure that we don't erase their work, but that we continue pushing these conversations and bringing Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority that are working at the intersecting of these issues to have a voice. Military veterans are facing homelessness, and many of them are elderly and disabled. The fact is that if the US military truly cared for its troops, it would have been to provide support to those who have already been thrown away by the system. Abolishing the military-industrial complex is environmental justice. It's not controversial to want militarized troops terrorizing and destroying people, animals, and culture. I deeply believe that wars create more harm than good. We must make love, not war, but yet conversations are constantly blaming other countries for the greed when the United States cannot hold itself accountable for their actions they have committed. You can find out more information on the sources I provided below to write this script, and follow Queer Brown Vegan for more environmental justice educational videos. Every time you subscribe, it supports my work, so thank you so much.